Greetings, foolish mortals. Today we're going to look at another vintage coffee maker that I recently acquired. We're actually looking at two vintage coffee makers of a style that you've probably seen before, but didn't know it was a distinct style in its own right. This is a style of coffee maker that has largely just been forgotten, completely overlooked. The style is the manual drip coffee maker. Now the thing is that you look up manual drip coffee maker, you'll probably find a lot about these bad boys. This is a Hario V60. It's commonly used for pour-over coffee. And the story of why the Hario V60 here it became popular is quite interesting in its own right. It was only introduced in 2004, and it became popular out of sheer spite when Starbucks acquired the Clover coffee maker company to sell their premium pour-over coffee, or drip coffee. And all of these independent coffee makers took one look at that and said, we are not fucking Starbucks, and went ahead and looked for an alternative, and as so happens, the Hario V60 was available, and they could get that with relatively low investment to replace the very expensive Clovers, and that's what happened. But the truth of the matter is, there was a form of manual drip coffee maker that predates this by a considerable degree. And you've probably all seen these things. If you have an older relative who's had one of these, sure, go ahead and note in the comments. These were popular in the early to mid 20th century, but they were completely replaced with the electric automatic drip coffee maker, which was introduced in the 1950s, which is interesting in itself, but I'll get to that. So as we've seen previously, and these are the ancestors here. This is the Neapolitan coffee maker. It's a flip coffee maker that was popular in the early 19th century. And it was replaced partially by these flip coffee makers, which were a little more complicated but had some built-in features. This is characteristic of the mid to late 19th century, even into the 20th century. Now, the thing is that these drip coffee makers really aren't substantially different in many ways, but the big difference is that whereas these coffee makers, you put cold water in the bottom, I forget which one's the bottom, you put cold water in and you heat it directly on the stove. The manual drip coffee makers, you put hot water into them, and the only reason they're staying on the stovetop is to keep them warm. So let's go into this a little bit further and see what we've got. This one really showcases some of the things that might be a bit confusing. Is at first blush, you probably think that this bad boy is actually a percolator. And it's a very understandable conclusion. It's quite tall like a percolator. It's got the characteristic glass knob of a percolator. Little different because you're probably used to seeing the more round glass knobs, but those are mostly aesthetic. They're mostly just so you can see when it's percolating, but you can also hear it. And it gets even more confusing when you look at the chamber here, because it sure looks like you've got that percolator tube that comes up and lets coffee out, and you just put and lets the hot water out, and you have coffee in this basket here. But then you start getting confused because where's the tube at the bottom? And the answer to that is there isn't a tube at the bottom, and you don't put the coffee in that upper chamber. Instead, with this one especially, you've got this is just a handle. This is just a handle. It is solid aluminum. The basket is a central chamber here. In fact, you'll see echoes of that in some of the more modern, trendy Kickstarter type ones. Is you got that central basket. So this one is the older model. This is a 1920s patent Drip-O-Lator coffee maker. You can see here the nice, clever labeling and all that. The very characteristic 1930s type of writing. This particular model, though, is probably from the 1940s or 1950s. You can tell from a number of things. The older models had a slightly different handle style. This has just a single bakelite handle. Very simplistic, very minimalistic. But they do have the advantage of being quite durable, as you can tell. Same basic design. You've got an upper chamber for hot water. You've got a central basket for the coffee, and for the ground coffee, excuse me. And then you've got, of course, the lower basket for the brewed coffee. And it's got a clip here to hold it in place, hold it together. This design, no clip. It just literally pulls apart. You see the 1950s, this is probably a 1950s model, mid-century modern bakelite handle, very aesthetic, especially the upper one, not a very good handle, but you actually honestly don't care much. Again, no clip holding it together. You've got a top for the basket with a solid handle, which again, it's just an aluminum wire that's twisted around, and the ground coffee goes in the basket here. These guys were all superseded by the electric drip coffee maker or automatic drip coffee maker with the introduction of Mr. Coffee in the 1950s. It's interesting that it took that long because so many other kitchen appliances weren't really didn't wait that long. That the moment you had electrification, people said, I can plug this in. I don't need to be making toast in the oven. I can be making toast on the kitchen counter. But nobody really felt the need to get rid of the stovetop kettle. And so you've still got the percolators, you've still got the manual drip coffee makers. And again, it wasn't until the 1950s when these were superseded. But then you've got the electric drip or automatic drip, as you might know them, coffee makers, which were dominant from the 1960s through into the 1990s. The big advantage to the manual drip coffee makers like this over something like this is the simple fact that it is convenient. This guy, you need to put the cold water in, you need to put the ground coffee, you need to put the cold water in, you need to put the ground coffee in, and you put it on the stove and you heat it up. And this takes forever. Honestly, start to finish, I would say 20 to 30 minutes to get coffee. This one, if you already have hot water, which there's a fairly good chance you do, both because of some of the ways that older stoves were built, or just because you, generally speaking, had a kettle of water on the stove most of the time, you can get coffee in just a few minutes. You do sacrifice a little bit of quality compared to the more sealed coffee pots, and that's a trend you'll see throughout the 20th century. More convenience, lower quality. So let's make some coffee. Again, this looks a lot like a percolator, but it is not even sort of a percolator. Because this is a very large coffee pot, this is supposed to make 6 to 8 cups of coffee. I have ground a whopping 100 grams of coffee here. As it is, in fact, a metal filter, I have preferred to make a pretty coarse, although not as coarse as French press, grind. So, medium coarse. There's no particular art to this, you just pour it in. It goes into the basket here. And that's the best angle I'm going to get on that. And did I screw up my angles? Although, no. And then you put it on top. You put your lid back in. That holds the coffee grounds in place. Now, since I do not actually normally keep a kettle of hot water going on the stove, we are going to do a slightly lower tech or slightly different approach, which is hot water out of a thermos. Because I have a hot water kettle on the counter, and I just am transferring it here, making sure it's nice and hot. Again, there is no art to this whatsoever. You just pour your coffee in, or your hot water in, and you pour in as much hot water as you desire. Since this is my coffee for the entire day, I am filling up the upper chamber entirely. And that is the entire brewing process. Very simple, very straightforward. No ceremony to it whatsoever. And as you might be able to hear, it is pretty rapidly brewing right now. I say it is a simple pour over coffee. This is as, well, it's not as simple as it gets, but there is no real effort to it whatsoever. You're just pouring, you're putting some hot water in a or you're putting some grounds in a basket and you're pouring hot water in. And you know when it is done brewing when the water has filtered through the top here, which I put the lid on to slow that down a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video because we don't need to see that all the time, but it'll only be a few minutes. All right, we're back. You can't really see the clock from here, but it only took about 3 or 4 minutes for it to brew. At this point, all the water has trickled out through the upper chamber, dripped through the ground coffee, and so we have brewed coffee in the bottom. Now, I would point out that while I say I used 100 grams of coffee, as is characteristic of this era of coffee maker, people very rarely used any sort of weight measurement for this. They would do volumetric, which is to say they would grab a can of coffee, because I have one readily available, can of coffee, in case you have never seen one. I don't know, kids be like that. And you would scoop out a number of scoops usually equal to the number of cups you were going to make. You could vary with this style of coffee maker, you could vary the amount you're making just by how much water you put in, and you could vary the strength by how much coffee you used, how much ground coffee you used. People probably didn't have a grinder of their own. They were getting pre-ground at the store. Well, for the most part, this was the mid-century 1950s era. But you were probably not grinding your own, and you were definitely not grinding your own with fancy burr grinders like we do today. So without further ado, let's take the top chamber off of this thing. Now it's dripping a little bit, but that's not important. I'm putting this over here on a plate because I don't want to make a mess. Relatively good piece of design. I just put that same lid back on here, so the upper and lower chamber, same size lid. Voila, I have a perfectly good serving pot. And this is actually a much better handle unto itself than the handle for the upper chamber, which is, as you can see, kind of awkward and weird shaped. But looks cool, right? So we've got a perfectly good coffee pot here, and we are pouring ourselves the coffee. It's a relatively weak brew, as such things go. But this was your cup of joe if you didn't use a percolator for a large part of the 20th century. This was what people made their coffee in at home. Larger scale productions usually use percolators. Stovetop percolators were, of course, very popular in the US as well. The issue with the percolator is that it takes very close timing and watchful eye to get decent enough coffee. You can get good coffee out of a percolator, but it's very, very easy to over or under brew it. This, on the other hand, if you use the right amount of coffee, that's pretty much the end of the matter. This is what you get. And you don't really need to look at these things very well. Well, that is definitely coffee flavored. It is, as I say, pretty weak. I probably should have used 120 grams. But next I'm going to just go ahead and leave this on the warming tray here. That's going to be my coffee for the rest of the day. Say most people above a certain age, which is to say those of us who are now in our 40s and 50s, might have an older relative who used one of these, but odds are pretty good we didn't realize what we were looking at. We probably assumed that we were looking at a percolator because percolators are slightly more iconic, but these manual drip coffee makers were very much the norm in the 1930s to 1950s, until the electric automatic drip coffee maker became popular. And hopefully you will not make the same mistake I did repeatedly with both of the manual drips that I got and mistakenly think that I was looking at a percolator. Learn from my mistakes. And probably if you should be using this, how much coffee do you need to use to brew it? More. If you want a decently strong cup, you probably need more coffee than you have planned on. I've done this on 80, it was a little weak. I've done this on 100 grams, it was a little weak. I might try 120 in the future, but probably not because I'm not sure I want to waste that much coffee on what is inherently a mediocre coffee maker, but it takes a lot of coffee. But you can vary your strength by the amount of coffee you use, and yeah, these kept people going for a fair bit of time. Thank you, foolish mortals, and have a good day.